March the 12th,
Yes.
1973, is in the home of Mrs. Nola Rigdon. We're most interested in Mrs. Rigdon and her accomplishments. We're in Crescent, Oklahoma. Mrs. Schaefer of Shawnee was our of Guthrie, pardon me, where I got the Shawnee. Mrs. Schaefer of Guthrie is to be our assistant on this, and I believe that I'm going to let her complete the credits and so on of Mrs. Rigdon. First, let me say that I talked with the Chamber of Commerce president of last year, Mr. Don Slack, and Mr. Slack tells me that she was most active in all of the promotional work of the Chamber of Commerce of Crescent, and that she is known as one of the leading citizens of this city. Now then, as to her personal life, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Schaefer.
Mrs. Rigdon, first of all, could I have your full name, including your maiden name, and the spelling of it?
Press down.
That's right.
Well, it's,
No, it's on. It's recorded.
oh, sorry. Nola Rigdon is my present name. My maiden name was Nolamore. And
Okay. Now, ma'am, if you could tell me your parents' names.
my father's name was Symore. My mother was Mary, Mary, Emily, Emily, Tonroy, Tonroy was her maiden name.
And where were your parents born?
My parents were both born in different places in Missouri. My father near Independence, Missouri. My mother nearer St. Joe, Missouri.
All right, and when were you born?
I was born November 22nd, 1889, east of Colorado Springs, Colorado, out there on the plains. The little town of Monument, which was their post office, has not been there for a long time.
But it was near Colorado Springs.
Yeah. About 40 miles east of Colorado Springs.
Okay. When did your family come to Oklahoma?
In the spring of 1891.
Did they settle a claim, take a claim?
The run had been April 22nd, 1889, and my father at that then bought what they call relinquishment from a man that had already settled on this place. But he did go on then and finish the 5 years of work required, and got the title to his claim at Kingfisher, Oklahoma, in 1894, which had been the 5th year.
Where exactly was this claim located?
It was about 5½ miles northwest of Crescent, Oklahoma. I could give you but I do not suppose it necessary to put down. It was the southeast quarter of Section 28, 184 West.
Okay. Can you tell us about your early schooling?
Well, I was a rather sickly child, and I would have had to go a mile and a half to our country school alone for most of the way. So my mother proceeded to teach me at home. She got the list of the required school books of that time, added several others, and I had my regular hours at my desk studying, and then I would recite my lessons, maybe not until the evening when my mother had time. I did that until I entered the Logan County High School at Guthrie the fall before I was 16.
And what year would that have been?
Well, that's 8, 9, 99, 1905.
What was Logan County High School? Can you describe it for us?
Well, at that time, there was only the one high school in the county that was supported by a levy, tax levy, and it was located on North Vine Street in Guthrie, Oklahoma. The students that had passed the 8th grade examination in their local schools could attend there if they cared to. Some would drive in. I boarded with a family also from near my home for the years I was attending. And
what subjects did you take, or what course were you in?
well, of course, the subjects were English and math and language, of course, it was called in those days, and history, and the writing, composition, and civics, which happened to be one of my most interesting subjects, and Latin. I could not, the only foreign language it taught at that time was German. I did not care to take it. I wanted to take Spanish, which was not available. I have never lost my love of Spanish, wishing I could know it.
Was by any chance Miss Etta Hikes your Latin teacher?
Yes, ma'am. Miss Etta Hikes was my Latin teacher, and then
How do you spell that name?
Hikes. She was teacher there for I'd have to go to the record to say how many years. And then there was one of my favorite teachers was Professor Hennessy. I think I owe my love of reading through the years, especially to him. Of course, I do not know when I learned to read. I cannot remember. But my mother also was a lover of reading. She would read to us in the winter evenings. But Professor Hennessy, a big, tall, red-haired Irishman, really made me love reading in all forms, and I still do.
Was he your English teacher?
No, he was my composition. It was writing and composition.
Is the town Hennessy named for him, or does he have any relationship?
No, there was no relationship between him and the town of Hennessy, Oklahoma. I do not know, do not remember it now at least. He came somewhere from the east. I could not say where. Another of my very special friends was a teacher from Edmond, Oklahoma. Her father had been connected with the Edmond School from the time of the start of that Edmond, what is now Edmond University. I want to go. She was Pearl Nyhart. Her father, as I said, was connected with the, and we became very close personal friends through the years until her death, a few years later when she was still a young woman.
During one of our visits, you mentioned that as part of your civics class assignment, you were to watch the Constitutional Convention, then going on in Guthrie. Can you describe some of the things you saw while you were there at the Constitutional Convention?
Well, it is held up in the second story of what was then the City Hall, a rather poorly built building. The acoustics were not considered when it was being built. But I did enjoy that. I would slip off whenever it was possible to get through with my work, even though it was not required to have a fascination for me. Colonel Murray, of course, later governor, was the presiding officer, and he would sit there with his feet up on the desk. But you can be sure that he knew what was going on, and he really knew his law also. And I think that I enjoyed that very much. I'm very disappointed that we did not become history conscious in time to save that building. All that we have left of that now is the bell that was on it. It is in front of the present City Hall.
Were there any incidents that occurred during the Constitutional Convention that really impressed themselves on your mind?
No, I do not think it was anything special because, of course, part of it was done in committees, and then the committees would come and they'd be reporting. It was a rather long, hard-fought deal because the people of the eastern part of Oklahoma did not want to really join in with the western part. They had their own history, and in fact, the first Constitutional Convention had been called in the eastern part of the county, of the state, as it is now, and they were very desirous of their own heritage, which was a great deal older than ours, on account of the 5 civilized tribes settling there. They were very desirous of having their own state, and it was a case of, you might say, compromise that finally resulted in the joining of the two parts of the. It was a very distinct break in the time that of the two territories. They were rather, and they had every reason to be conscious of their heritage there. Ours had been only a cattle grazing country. And then the Chisholm Trail, of course, which I have traveled several times, came through, and the Cherokee Strip that was later opened was left as a entryway for the Cherokee tribe to go to the west to hunt the buffalo, which they did not ever take advantage of, because they were not a hunting tribe. And we only had the hunting tribes that had been wandered up and down the western part. So it was very easy to understand that they felt like they had much more in their part from the early 1700s, and we only, as our part, only started in '89. But I am glad to say that we needed each other, and as years have gone, I think it has proven the wise deal that we did compromise and did become one state.
Was the general atmosphere of the convention one of dignity, subdued voices, and that sort of thing?
No, there was not much dignity about it. A lot of the people that it is their first, especially from this part, is their first experience in something like that. I could not say there was very much dignity involved. Nor, of course, like I say, a great deal of the arguments had taken place in the different committees, they when they would come to report, it would only be what the committee had. They would get into some hot arguments sometimes, but there again, Bill Murray knew his law, and they could only go so far.
You also mentioned during one of our visits, that you had seen the inauguration that took place in 1907. Could you tell us about that?
Well, of course, it was to a lot of us a very important thing, but of course, I was just a youngster there, you might say. So I was standing under a little tree just across what is now the street, in front of the Carnegie Library. The Carnegie Library, by the way, had been, I had almost lived in it during the time I was in school, because I loved books, and I had never been exposed to that many at any one time. And after I would go there to prepare some lesson or something, I would stay on and take out as many books as I could also. I never knew and do not today know when I get enough reading. But it was a very impressive ceremony. Of course, the actual swearing in had been done before that. When our territorial governor relinquished and the state governor took over. Of course, that had been before that. Of course, that was supposed to represent a wedding of the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And, of course, the lady was dressed very, very effectively in the costume of that time, and, of course, the man also. I, of course, did not personally know either one of them. But as I say, it was a very impressive ceremony, and it was a fairly nice day that day. And I am glad that I had the privilege of seeing it.
Were there any other celebrations that took place along with this inauguration?
Oh, well, no, not particularly. Of course, there was the balls and the things like that just the school youngsters of that day were not invited to.
Can you describe the dress of the people who attended the inauguration ceremonies in front of Carnegie Library?
Well, of course, it was just a very mixed crowd. There was none of that was on the asked-to-be basis. There was no invitations for that. It was just an open-air affair. And, of course, everyone was dressed in the ordinary style of that time, which it varied about like it does today. There's what was a very best of the day's fashions, and then the others were dressed a lot of them were dressed very plainly in their calico, and the men in their overalls.
All right. What year did you graduate from Logan County High School?
I did, on account of ill health, a breakdown, perhaps because I had not been the place I had been boarding. The food was not, it was far from being the best. And the last year I started, and after 2 weeks, my health became so bad that I had to go home and was in bed most of that summer, so that I failed to graduate. And those days in time, you did not have a second chance, as perhaps you could do today. But I have always felt like that even though I did not obtain my diploma, that one's learning never stops. And I have tried to follow that rule through all the years that have passed.
Well, what type of illness did you have when you were sick that time?
Well, the doctors that day called it just a nervous breakdown. It is simply the fact, mainly, that the food had not been an adequate diet. The lady was a very good good person, but a very poor cook. And that finally, that fall, my mother, of course, could not think of me being on my own. She felt safer with me in that family home, even though she did not realize how poor the food was, how poorly prepared, rather. So that fall, I had gotten a furnished room and prepared to take care of myself that year, and I think it would have been a great deal better because I had done the cooking at home for so long that cooking did not bother me. But like I say, I had worked very hard that summer, as the summer before, as all of us did on the farm at that time. So that when I went to then and started back to school that fall, I realized that my health I had to quit. But like I say, I still have kept on learning.
After you recovered from your illness, what did you do then?
Well, I just kept on in the taking care of my part of in the family home, which at that time was my father, mother, grandmother that was getting rather feeble. But my mother had never cared for cooking and the housework. She loved to sew and write. So as I took over, and when I then was due to be married when I was 23, she said she'd have to learn how to cook over again. Fortunately, I didn't have to practice on my husband.
What was your husband's name, and would you spell it for us?
My husband was Alfred, Alfred Rigdon, and he was 21 just 9 weeks after we were married. The reason that we were married before he was 21, as I said, I was 23 past, was the fact that we wanted to spend 2 weeks in western Oklahoma. That is what was called western Oklahoma, out around Tologa and Watongan, out in there, visiting some of his father's people. And while we knew that we would have the spring work coming up, and after his birthday, the 9th of March, it had been impossible to have taken off the 2 weeks, so we were married the 9th of January, just 3 years after we had first started keeping company, as they called it then. And then we took the 2 weeks visiting the people in the Drummond and Watonga and Tologa out in there, so that then we came back and got our home ready, and of course then went in. Of course we had only had the one team at that time, and the farm work was all done with horses.
Where did you meet your husband?
Well, that would be hard to say because we were in adjoining neighborhoods. I could not even tell the first time that we met. We might have been at a box supper, might have been what they call the literary, or perhaps in the church not where I attended, but where his people attended, because we'd had meetings first one place and then another. And from the time of 1898, when my people bought me a beautiful organ, I learned to play that, and I was quite demand. I was always glad to play whenever I felt like it was something I could give pleasure to someone else. So I would go all over our community when there would be what they call revival meetings and play for the singing. So I really cannot say when that we started. We first met each other.
Well, would you describe your courtship to us?
Well, of course, it was that my people were rather unhappy because they didn't think, even though I was then 18 past, they didn't think I was quite grown up enough But of course, he had a team and buggy, and of course he would come, and we would go to church in the evening. We'd always have to attend our own. Mine at that time, most of the time, was in the country schoolhouse where we had the Union Sunday School, and any minister that came to the country would speak to us. While I was in, I had attended the church in Crescent, the Baptist church at that time, and was a member there. But we did not, especially in the morning time, you did not drive your horse had been in the field perhaps all day into town to church if they'd been busy. So I did not again attend the church in Crescent, especially in the morning, very, very little. But then we would drive there, or maybe if there'd be a meeting in the neighborhood, well, we would go there. And once in a while on Fridays, we would go maybe to literary, as they called it, or box supper or something like that there. But it was a very quiet time, and in fact, we had gone together just exactly 9 months when he asked me to marry him. And then in the year of 1911, I again had it was a lung condition that I went to Colorado and spent the summer and came back. Then we were married in 1913.
Where did you make your first home?
It was on the part of my father's land, the little house that we had been built for people that would come there and pick cotton or work that way. So then we just fixed it up. It's just a little 2-room home, and we fixed it up for our first home.
And what was your husband's profession?
He was a farmer, always. And but like I say, that was where our first home was. But we had only been married about 6 months, and he had to go to the hospital at Oklahoma City, which was then the Wesley Hospital, for a durable hernia operation. And by the way, I at one time here, not too many years ago, I picked up our hospital, what our hospital bill was at that time, and it hardly kept us there one day today. That then, when he came back, why, we did not try to go back there. We stayed in another small home near my father's home, because by that time my grandmother had become quite ill. My mother needed help in taking care of her. So we lived there then the rest of the time until my husband passed on.
And what year was that?
1917. We were married a little over 4 years when he was accidentally hurt and died on the operating table at Guthrie. And so then we were due at that time. My father and mother, my mother's health had kept getting worse, and she was a diabetic before they discovered insulin. And they had planned to move into the town of Crescent, and we were to move a mile from the old home place. It had been rented to someone else, and we were to move over there, which I did the following January after losing my husband, the 2nd day of August, 1917. There, I made my home for 30 years. And but like I say, we were farming what had been my the place where I grew up, and also the adjoining 160 to the south of us the year that I lost my husband.
So you then moved back in with your family and made...
No, definitely not. No, I never moved in with my people. My father and mother had moved in. They moved into Crescent, and I moved over there alone.
Oh, wow.
And on the farm where we were intended to, because that place where I was living had been rented to someone else, and of course, at that time, the change of renters was always the first of the year. So I moved over there, and then I did not mention the fact that the 9th of April, 1915, we had our little boy was born that did not live. And so then just after then my husband's death, we before that had planned to adopt a baby, because the doctors had said no more children for myself. But then World War I came on. My husband registered and did not give me a dependent, because he said, I know that you can take care of yourself. He did not put me as a dependent. But, of course, he got accidentally killed before he was ever called up. But for the following spring then, after I was there, I still felt like I should adopt a child. And at that time, because the laws were not as strict as they are today, possibly a widow woman would not have had a chance. But I did have, at that time, I went to a little nursing home that was handled out of Oklahoma City. I had the address. And they brought in several children. And the one that looks the most forlorn little fella, he was 6 in March before I adopted him in the May, I think it was. So he came to be with me. Of course, I made the legal adoption 6 months following. But he did never care for the farm. And he came, I took him down and took him to the barn, gave him a little heifer calf for his and all. But he was 1/4 Choctaw Indian. And a fact I was not conscious of at the time, which would not have made any difference if I had known it. But he did never care for the farm or the stock. He was interested in machinery, but in that day and time, the machinery until after he left the farm, I went ahead and bought a Ford tractor. But I was never able to handle it like I could my 4 head of horses or mules. I could handle them, but I could never crank the tractor.
What was your adopted son's name?
His name was Edwin, Edwin, Edwin Rigdon, but he did never like that name. So when he started school, he told the teacher his name was Pete, P-E-T-E, and while I had little use for that particular name, if that was what he wanted, that was the way he went through school.
And what year did you adopt him?
In the spring of 1918.
You mentioned you could handle your team of 4 horses better than any Ford tractor. Did you do most of the work on the farm by yourself?
Oh yes. I loved stock. And after my husband and I were married, prior to his going, if that was what he wanted, that was the way he went through school.
And what year did you adopt him?
In the spring of 1918.
You mentioned you could handle your team of 4 horses better than any Ford tractor. Did you do most of the work on the farm by yourself?
Oh yes. I loved stock, and after my husband and I were married, prior to his going to the hospital for an operation, it was not safe for him to be out because he had a double hernia, and he might have to have help even out in the field. So I learned to be out with him a great deal. And naturally, I had helped my father take care of feed our stock and milk cows and all while I was at home. So it was no problem to me I had 4 part Persian mares that I used as brood mares, and would sell the mule colts at the fall, and then I also had 4 headed mules. But they were rather, of course, both the mares and the mules were rather tall and large. But I used heavy harness, but I would manufactured me some extra buckles that I could put on I'd stand on a box to fasten the collars on my horses or mules. Then I would use some snaps, and I would only put on part of the heavy harness at a time, which made it a good deal easier for me.
Were there any extraordinarily good years while you were farming, where you made real good crops?
No, it was mostly until not too many years before I left the farm. I had only handled 160, and it was mostly grassland, which was the reason my husband and I had planned to start to when we intended to stay on the farm where we were. First, if we were going to raise the Holstein cattle and sell the cream and use the skim milk to raise hogs, which we had been doing, in fact, on a smaller scale for several years. In fact, most of the time after we were married, one of our first purchases was a deal-about cream separator. That when I moved to the farm alone, I knew that I had no business with the registered Holstein cattle, which were mainly milk producing. So I investigated and went ahead and purchased my first registered shorthorn cattle in the fall of 1917, after I had definitely decided to stay on the farm. So for 30 years then, I handled registered shorthorn cattle. And well, in fact, when I left the farm in the 40s, I was the oldest at that time in point of years as a registered shorthorn breeder in Oklahoma.
What did your neighbors think of a woman trying to farm a place all by herself?
Well, knowing me and the fact that I grew up in that community, they did not think much about it. If I needed extra help, I would have no trouble in a neighbor boy would come and maybe work for the day or 2 or 3 days if I needed. Of course, in making fence or something like that, I would need a help. And so I tried to be a fair boss and not ask them to do anything that I didn't do myself. And I never had any trouble with the neighborhood boys. At one time, I had planned to move down, in fact, bought land down near Monroe, Louisiana, because it was an ideal country for cattle. But there was a neighbor that did not live very close, but his dad had also been interested in shorthorn cattle, so he had said if I bought down there, he would move down with me. I would not attempt to go into a unknown country like that was and handle the things alone, because I wouldn't know what kind of help I could hire. So when he backed out and decided he would not go, I finally sold the land in Louisiana, because, like I say, I had no trouble neighbor boys helping me out at home.
You mentioned that you moved off the farm then in the 1940s. What was the reason that you left the farm?
I, much against my will, I had a friend living in the little town of Crescent. Her youngest daughter and I had been sister-in-laws. In fact, I lost her not before I was married even. So the mother needed someone to look after her. The 4 grandsons were living in California. I sent for them to come, but in that time there was no supervised nursing homes. She would have been eligible through her husband or son to have gone to our Masonic home at Guthrie, but at that time her mind was becoming a little affected, and also her eyesight. So they could, at that time, could not handle her at the Masonic home. I had investigated the nursing homes in Oklahoma City, and I would not consider putting anyone in the type of home it was at that time. So when I sent for the grandsons to come back, well, they looked into it too, and they came out one day and said, they all called me Aunt Nola, said, Aunt Nola, it's up to you to go in and take care of Grandma. I said, boys, I cannot do that on the spur of a moment. I cannot, and that was a bad year as far as price of stock was concerned. And I had not only the registered cattle, but grade stock also.
What year was that, ma'am?
I'd have to, I could not tell you. I know it was in the 40s, but I'd have to go to my records to say the exact date. But I do know it was a bad year for us to try to dispose of anything. Well, they said, that's all it can be. I said, all right, give me until the 1st of September, and I'll make what arrangements I can, and I'll move in, be with your grandmother the 1st of September. I sold at a great loss. I sold quite a bit of the stock. And then there was a colored man that lived at Guthrie that used to come out. He loved stock. He used to like to come out and visit me. So I got him to come out and stay on with the stuff that I was trying to hold on to until the prices got better. And I came on in and took care of her, but I hadn't started taking care of her very long. I discovered she was also afflicted with cancer. We buried her the Christmas Eve that year. But in the meantime, I had sold off too much of my stock to try to pick it up again, so I stayed on in Crescent.
You mentioned that in 1898, owing to your father's health, your family made a trip to Colorado. Could you describe what his condition was and for us?
Well, it was, he had come in 1891 from Colorado and was not used to the extreme heat of especially the harvest time in Oklahoma. And of course, the harvesting was all done with the horse-drawn binders, and a lot of extra work went in. Maybe they would have to take the team off the binder and drive 14 to 20 miles to get repairs. And it was a rather trying time, and generally in very hot weather. And in the summer of 1897, he had become overcome. He had become exhausted by the heat and had what they call a heat stroke. And the doctors told him he should not. He went then that fall and doctored in a sanitarium at Kansas City, Missouri. Be still, when he came back the following spring, his health did not justify trying to do anything on the farm. In 97, he had rented his wheat land to a neighbor boy. So he decided that spring, he said, I'll fix up a covered wagon, and we will go back to Colorado and travel through the mountains. I think he really, tell the truth of the matter, I think they were really a little homesick for Colorado. But that is what he did. We fixed up the covered wagon with the slats, made an extension on the sideboards so we could put a mattress in. At that time, my grandmother was making her home with us, and she also made the trip with us that year. She was getting quite old, but she'd get in and out of the wagon with help, and she really seemed to enjoy it. And so we left home in May, and the first part of May, before it got too hot, we would travel. We went up to by Cherokee and up into hit the western part of Kansas, which at that time was almost a deserted country. The people had come in there in the earlier 90s and had tried to farm as they did in the east, with the corn, raising the corn and stuff, and the western western Kansas was not a corn country, as of course was found out in later years. They had come in there, settled on the journey on 160, had built fine schoolhouses and wells, and then when after 2 or 3 dry years had given up, went back to the eastern country, eastern states. We would, as we were traveling through there, maybe we would drive all day, which is journey about 15 miles. We would stop at noon and give the team an hour's rest and fix our own lunch, which is always generally would not try to build a campfire at noon. But we would learn we could camp by a schoolhouse of an evening. There was always well there that had not been too long, but water was still safe. We'd camp there and go on until we hit what was the Arkansas River. And then there was no, they were using it then in Colorado to irrigate their alfalfa and their sugar beet fields and all. I'll never forget the odor of the alfalfa fields as we drove through. I had never yet found perfume from Paris any place else had equaled the smell of the alfalfa blossoms. And so we journeyed very quietly along through the Arkansas, past La Junta and on to Colorado Springs, and then drove out to my uncle's home east of Colorado Springs, not far from where I was born. And I enjoyed, of course, I was too small. They threw me away naturally when I couldn't get around the campfire. But I would have a lot of fun exploring up and down around. And then when we got to my uncle's, my grandmother stayed there with my mother's half-sister for the summer. And after visiting a few days, then we took the team and traveled Cripple Creek, Canyon City, and all those places. There was not much of a wagon road, and a lot of it through the canyons was just a tri-place wagon road, or the railroad, and the mountain stream, whichever one it was. We had a team of a gray horse and a bay mare. She was very high-strung, but they made a very good working team, except they had not been around at that time. They never saw a train. Whenever the train would come to that canyon, it was quite a problem to hold that one mare down until the train would go. But it was a very enjoyable summer, something I have never forgotten. And through the different canyons, you really think you can enjoy nature. You take it through in a covered wagon. Today, when you skim through those same canyons at about 50 or 60 miles an hour, even with a careful driver, you fail to see a lot. We visited an old Cripple Creek mine, the abandoned mine, and we picked up a little package of gold dust there. My mother had, when she was a child, someone had given her a little candy jar, a little boy on a barrel filled with candy. She had kept the jar, little boy, and when we came home that fall, we put our gold dust from Cripple Creek mine into that, and it still is sitting in my window. That little boy is on his gold dust barrel. And we then came back and picked up my grandmother and came back, returning home in late September.
What members of your family made this trip?
Well, it was my father, mother, myself, and my grandmother, as I spoke, until she stayed at near the little town of Peyton with my uncle.
You've mentioned your grandmother several times. What was her name? Would you spell it?
Well, I think I gave it to you, and I gave them, her name was Tonroy, Emily Tonroy, Emily, Conroy. Her husband, a Baptist minister at that time, while he was educated for a Catholic priest when he was in Ireland, he came over from Ireland during the time of the famine, helped build the Erie Canal, which in later years I enjoyed. While it is not used now as the Erie Canal, I enjoyed riding by that part of the country in New York when I was fortunate enough to be back there one year. But my grandmother then, after my grandfather's death, made her home with us.
Approximately how long did it take you to get from Crescent to your uncle's place?
It was in late June when we arrived there after leaving. I couldn't say just exactly what day in May we left, but in late June we arrived at my grandfather's, at my uncle's.
All right, now let's get back to the 1940s again, and we left you in Crescent. You had more or less given up your farm.
Well,
you still had it, but you didn't plan to go back. What did you do then?
Well, after this lady's death, had been a help-yourself laundry put in the lower part of the building where I now live, put in by a couple from Mulhall. They would come over and put it in and then run it in the winter, and then in the springtime they would sell it and go back and harvest their crop and come back and buy it in the fall. I contacted them about buying it, but it was in the wintertime and they did not want to sell. They told me they'd give me a chance in the spring. I went ahead nursing, which was something I had followed through the years. In fact, my doctor tried to get me to take up nursing, registered nursing at my husband's death. And my health at certain times is all that kept me from doing it. It was all that kept me from staying on the farm rather than nursing, because that had always been my second love. But through the years, I have been fortunate enough to be able to help a great many people, even though I never attended the nursing school. Oh, I am thankful that I did that. But during that time, after this lady's death, I did nursing with people that needed me, but I did not care to live out of a suitcase all the time, and I'd go here and there. So when they came to me that spring and offered to sell, I bought this Help Yourself laundry, which of course was Maytags that was the ringer type, that people came in and would rent a tub for an hour and do their own washing, or of course, I did a great deal of custom work, both washing and ironing. And but when they came back that fall, they found they were up against it. I did not sell for 10 years.
Do you happen to remember what kind of prices were charged for this laundry work? How much did it cost for a woman to come in and rent?
It was so much an hour. It was, I raised it at one time. It was from 60 cents an hour. You furnish the water, and there was the main machine, and then there were 3 rinse tubs that you would fill with water and change it as often as they asked for it.
Was Crescent at this time that you had the laundry the kind of town it is today? Was it about the same size?
Well, no, hardly, because it was during the time. In fact, I had a great deal of trouble the first years that I took over, because during that fall war time, when you could not get equipment that you needed, the town then was very much as it had been through the years after they moved. When the railroad came through in 1905, when they moved then, to 1903, I believe it was, beg your pardon. But anyway, we moved a half a mile west of the location of the early day, and it hadn't grown too much. There was drugstores, and two drugstores as there is today, and the two banks. But they up and down the street had not varied very much. There'd only been one building moved over from the old town, we called it. But then there was none of the additions that now have been added. The first addition was out to the northeast here, and then of course they have been all around since then. People are coming in for retirement purposes, or people come in from the farm and would move in here. But of course at that time there was still plenty of locations in the main town itself.
During the time you had your laundry business here in Crescent, what was the major business that kept Crescent going? Was it just a farm town, or did it have any industry?
No, there's no industry. No, it was a farm town. At one time there were two cotton gins, and then not the co-op that we have today, but there were two different wheat elevators, we called them, and it was the land to the north of us was practically all wheat raising. They went in some to soybeans in the later years, but it was they would raise the wheat, and then they would cattle were shipped from here by rail, and then also to around Crescent here, and to the south was more sandy country where there was more cotton raised. And of course there was no trouble then in getting people to chop and pick the cotton. And at that time they did pick it. Of course in later years they did what they call snapping it, but they would pick it, and some of the school would take out for a while in the fall, so the children could pick cotton, because they would depend on that to get their to live on, to get their school clothing, and then to get their groceries until the following spring, when the cotton chopping time came on.
During the time you owned the laundry, what were some of your other activities?
Well, of course, it was, you might say, it was a 6 day a week, early and late. I did not, outside of the Chamber of Commerce that I started working with from the time I had first been in town, and attending church when it was so I could get away. Why, that was about the extent of my work.
A while back you were talking about your adopted son. What happened to him? Did he leave your home?
Well, as soon as he became old enough, that was while I was still on the farm, he went to work in the oil fields, and he kept that up. And probably, even though he had several very serious accidents, there's something gets in the blood for oil field work that they cannot. He tried twice to get out of it. He's never satisfied. And after he had become injured so many times, he then went to work repairing oil field engines at Oklahoma City until he had passed on following a complete stroke in the fall of '69.
Tell us, if you will, how it came to be that you gave up the laundry.
Well, I got so tired of being. I would get so. Felt like I was in jail too much of the time. I had been used to the outdoors where I could, and the building that I bought here did not even have the glass windows were on the north, and I would get so hungry to be outside that sometimes during the time we still had bus service here in Crescent, I would leave someone I could trust, and I'd get on the bus on Friday evening, go to Oklahoma City, and get a bus ticket as far as I could go down to southeast Oklahoma for Saturday and come back Sunday and then come on back here to work. I just had gotten so tired of being hedged in that I decided, and it was hard to get help, to get efficient help. So a lady that had been working for me some of the time, I sold her the equipment and then stepped out and decided that I'd at least get out of jail part of the time.
You've been associated with the newspaper business for a number of years. When did you first get involved in this kind of work?
Well, after I did away with the laundry, I of course I had done these people's laundry through the years after they came here, and it all had been on a friendly basis with them. So I'd stop in there, and they were short of help, so I just dropped in to helping until their daughter became older, and they felt like that they could handle it. So I stepped out for a while, and was just interested in first one thing, then another, and which included I was fortunate enough to be able for over 3 years to put in 1 and 2 days at the Veterans Hospital at Oklahoma City, doing what I liked so well, the nurses' aid work. But it got to where then I could get no one else to go down, and I had to give that up, much to my regret. Then I was dropped in later then to see these people, and in the meantime they had found that the owner, his health was failing, so they asked me to take on at least some of the notification work, and it ended up then that for quite a few years I put in the 6 days a week there, unless I'd lock the door and slip off during the weekend, for my boss was never there after Wednesday night, and I regretted, but I did take off, especially with Thursday afternoon for Chamber of Commerce meetings, and then sometimes I'd take off for the weekend for a meeting at some of my church work.
Oh, what was the newspaper owner's name?
It was Charles, Charles, Charles Owen, Owen, and his wife, Bobby, Bobbie.
And what type of work did you do?
Well, I made the remark one time, I was writing to the Stillwater electric paper, trying to get in touch with a friend. Her husband and I had been on this county fair board for years, and we'd lost track of each other. So they came out a piece about her in the Stillwater paper, and I wrote, asked to have my letter forwarded on to her, and I made the remark I was a printer's devil at the Lone County News. I thought that was a phrase that would be that any former newspaper people would understand, but they sent somebody over in a month or so to interview me to find out what in the world a printer's devil was. I told them that it meant doing what the things the boss didn't want to do. Of course, the name originated in the days when they as all handset type, and he'd get the type in wrong. Why he'd get the blame for it. In other words, the man saying the type would be called the printer's devil. But in later years, then, just anyone that kept busy.
So what type of presses did you use for the newspaper?
Well, we used what we call the hot metal. We still are. They're still a hot metal. They had not gone offset.
And how often was the Logan County News published?
Once a week. We'd always have to go to press sometime, hopefully on Wednesday night, and then they'd put in the post office on Thursday. They'd have, it runs around 1,700 of the circulation. the local routes, and then we have from Alaska to Saudi Arabia as is the outside mailing.
Did you also write news stories?
Well, no, I had very little time for that. The local paper like this is made up mostly with the happenings of the school or the livestock show, whatever it is, the front page, and then what we call the local correspondence from the different areas around, and because they would send in their notes about who had visited and where they'd gone, and that is a very necessary part of a hometown paper. The people perhaps in California would order their subscription so that they could find out what the people have been doing back home.
Do you recall any unusual experiences while you were working with the newspaper?
No, it was just a general run of the mill, just that day in, day out work. Maybe the presses would work, maybe they wouldn't, and maybe we wouldn't get one thing doing the proofreading. I can assure you that you can proof that every inch of that, but you'll miss. There's a general thing. A small town this way does not have earth-shaking happenings. Of course, maybe there'll be someone that's been injured in an accident or something like that. But generally, Crescent as a whole has been able to avoid any real tragic happenings through the years, for which we're very thankful.
Do you recall any major storms, tornadoes, floods, things of that sort that have occurred?
Well, we're not where we would have that our storms or flood and all like that, but we're not. We're far enough away from the Cimarron River that we are not affected by flood. And we have also been very fortunate in no tornado has hit this town directly. It has been all around us at different times, but we've had some severe hail that has damaged a lot of the roofs, but then, and of course, speaking of fire, then across the street from where I live was another fire that for a while didn't know whether they could keep it up across the street from where I live.
What type of fire department does Crescent have?
We have a very wonderful volunteer fire department. They have, it's been, I cannot say, and I'd have to go back to the records, how many years it has been since they got the first fire truck. And each year for also, I think this year was our 19th year, that in the last Saturday in January, they have what they call a fireman's bean supper. And on account of the storm this year, they fed fewer than ordinary, which was only, I think they only fed around 1,600 or 1,700 this year. We have gone up farther than that. The men, the volunteer firemen, their wives, they had immense pots that they would buy the ham and buy the beans and prepare them a day ahead. And then the ham and beans and cornbread is always baked by the panfuls. And then the women of the community would furnish the pie. and then they would sell that for $1 to each one that would come, all they could eat. And if they didn't, it's their own fault, because there's always they'd come up and down the aisle with the big containers of ham and beans. So, but that has then the money from that has gone to buying better gas masks or things like that for the fire department. We have now just recently, in the last year, put in a very modern fire truck. We still have the other one that we use. In fact, we have two now that had been. We use them in case of emergency or out of town, because the main fire truck cannot leave the city because of danger. But I can say that when I had my own fire here, the 5th day of August, that I had hardly. They only a block from me, but they were here almost immediately. But even with their gas masks, they could not come in. As smoke was so dense in the hall that they could not come in with their hose. They had to go to outside and break a window. But they were able to contain the fire very well, and they're always very alert. They, after a certain length of time, the firemen will retire, and then new ones take their place.
Is that fire in this place, or?
Yeah, right here. This is all new. This is all.
The second part for senior citizens?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, speaking about how the fire started, after I had sold the laundry and the lady then abandoned it, for several years, while I was not working at the news office, I ran a rummage sale for our church. And and I would keep that going and sell articles to the people, and then would do up boxes for our church world service. But I fixed it up then, decided to fix it up for the Senior Citizen Center. But after considerable work, they decided that in the meantime they had rented once a day a week. They had rented the Legion Hall. And after I had it all ready, they decided to stay on there. I used it then for a year for community meetings of different kinds, and young people or any. And then this man needed a cabinet shop very badly, and I gave him, at least a building to him downstairs. But in the meantime, how I'd been paying all the bills, my electric light down in my cellar was connected to the downstairs. And I asked an electrician to come up and shift it to my upstairs meter. He came that day and was checking and flipped a circuit breaker and said, "Oh, you've got a short someplace." In the meantime, I had been working back in this room where there's a light bulb. They'd been out of commission for quite a while. Apparently, when he flipped the circuit breaker, that bulb exploded, and I stepped out in the hall after about 10 minutes, thinking of the price he was charging. I wished he'd find that short. And I looked down the hall, and there's a fire, smoke. And I ran down, and apparently that light bulb had exploded and had caught some material on fire. And that was when I called the fire department, and they came very quickly. But as I say, even though that gas mask that they had bought from some of the result, they had to break in. But they did a wonderful job of containing my fire, and it's mostly been fixed back again.
You have been a member of the Chamber of Commerce for some number of years. Could you tell us about some of their activities?
Well, we have the main activity of the Chamber of Commerce has been the sponsoring the Christmas parade, and sometime the first part of December, and then buying the treats. Of course, buying the treats to put out to the children when the day that Santa Claus would come to town, and paying paying the bills for the prizes for the floats and all. In fact, this past year, well, we spent about in the neighborhood of $1,200 for in prizes. We would give prizes. We gave 10 turkeys the day Saturday before Thanksgiving, and we had free money drawings during the Saturdays before, just something to get to bring the people into the town and try to give them their money's worth in the stores. The merchants have been very, they've been very considerate and very helpful about paying. We have what we call a certain amount assessed to each business. They've been very good about that, but they're very poor about getting in to attend our business meetings. They're always so tied up. We have tried the noon meetings, the evening meetings, and now we've settled for the afternoon meeting, but we still are not able to get nearly the people involved that we need.
Why do you think this is?
Well, one thing, we're scheduled with so many things of our school activities and the different church activities. You cannot find a time, a free night, to schedule anything. Like we had a time when we had our installation of our new officers at Chamber of Commerce. We had to take 2 hitches at trying to get a night that we could have it out at the Twin Lakes out here. Very interesting development, quite a ways out of town, where mostly retired people come up from Oklahoma City.
What offices have you held in the Chamber of Commerce?
I have never. I've just been working. There again, I guess jack of all trades. They depend on me to get the notices in the paper. They depend on me to notify the members. They depend on me to make the yearly collection of our dues, and anything else that someone else doesn't have the time for. Well, I try to get it worked in.
In talking with the former president, this is Mary V. Roberts making this addition. In talking with Mr. Don Slack, former president of the Chamber of Commerce here, he said, well, she does anything and everything. I could recommend her in any line, just so it's promotion and something going forward.
All right, Mrs. Rigdon, could you tell us about some of the other organizations you belong to?
Well, the one thing I had been interested in from the time we first organized it here has been what we call the OEO, Office of Economic Opportunity. We first organized that at the second floor of our City Hall. It's been back about 5 years ago now, and I have worked for that all the time as a local president or vice president of our local group, which works for, of course, for the Head Start. And then for about 4 years now, I have been a director of our 27-member board of our 3 counties, Logan, Lincoln, and Seminole counties. But of course, it seems as if that we're probably being pretty well phased out of that with the latest cuts in the at our last board meeting. We figured we probably would not assemble as a board but more than one more time.
I had heard that you also belong to the Oklahoma Press Association. Is this true?
Oh yes, of course. Through my work at the newspaper office, I have the last 3 years I have had been fortunate enough to attend the Press Association meetings, which means a great deal to me because our secretary, our senators and representatives will meet with us at least one day from Washington. And of course, last year, a year ago, with the election coming up, we had the members that were going to run for the Senate running out of our ears, you might say. This past year, Press Association meeting this year, was highlighted by the fact of the meeting of E.K. Gaylord with us just before his 100th birthday, and it is a pleasure to be with him.
Are there any other organizations you belong to?
Well, of course, I have been fortunate to be allowed in these later years to get to work with my church quite a bit. I work with my state church office as much as I can, and I represent our church and our District 3 at our state conventions and our national conventions, which I've been attending for a good many years. But I feel like that I gain far more than I can give at something like this.
What church do you belong to?
I belong to the Disciples of Christ First Christian Church. Well, shall we have left out one thing that I'm very interested in, and that's history. And speaking about the World Wars, my first recollection was of the Spanish-American War in 1898. One of the neighbor boy that had, while I was just a child, and he'd always paid quite a bit of attention to me, and would always be, when he'd see me, he'd always be stroking my long curly hair. And my father and I drove into Crescent one morning, and this man, Roy Fisher, was just getting ready to leave for the Spanish-American War. So he told my father goodbye, and he kissed me goodbye, and that was he fortunately came back to us, and but that was my first recollection as to telling some of our loved ones goodbye in the war. Of course, World War I was very involved in on account of my husband, and he was expecting any time for him to go, and a lot of our neighbor boys went, and I kept in touch with as many of those boys as I could to that war. Unfortunately, not all of them came back to our home community. World War II came on. There again, I was almost directly involved because a neighbor boy that had become like a son to me was one of the first to go that time. I went to that time to Oklahoma City to see him off. But then again, a lot of our boys did not come back. But the one thing that was especially interesting in that time was we had, of course, the sugar rationing. But we would save our sugar, and then I had learned to make Aunt Bill's brown candy, which, and they do not know how many pounds of that I made and sent to the boys in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. This boy that was so near to me, he landed the second day of the Battle of the Bulge on the French coast, the second day of the landing there, and then he was also involved in the Battle of the Bulge. But our neighborhood community we'd meet every so often and make up candy and cookies and things, and we learned that in order to get for our boys, especially in the Pacific, to get them, we would put them in cans like we used to can our fruit in with sealing wax. We'd buy those cans by the dozens, and then some of us would peel them and others would seal them, and that way we could send them to the boys, and the dampness would not affect it. Otherwise, the boys would get so many of them would so long getting their packages, and when they did, they'd be all mildewed and lost, which made it tragic. And that was then, of course, I have not been as closely involved with the boys that have gone to the Vietnam War. In fact, very few have gone from this part of the country in connection, and nothing like they did in World War II. But that there again, history, I have been a history buff from the years that I was studying history in county high school, and I've never lost that interest. And I have especially enjoyed the good many years, getting into the 20s now, that I have been connected with the Oklahoma Historical Society. In fact, we made 19 state historical tours during that time on various parts of our state that would be mostly 3 days, but charter buses. And was fortunate to make every one of them. In the last 2 years, we have not had it, and they had not had one, and they have been rather unhappy with me, I think, down at the state office, because I've been still hollering for them. And Milt Phillips of Seminole has halfway promised we'll have one this year. He'd better come across with it.
Another phase of history that we just completely skipped over was the Depression years. Now, during the Depression years, where were you?
I was staying on the farm at that time, and it was a tragic time. Perhaps those of us on the farm, we did have enough food to get by, even though we had no money to get anything else with. But I have several times in being with friends at the hospitals during that time, I especially was impressed with looking out at St. Anthony's Hospital, especially, where I was with a friend quite a bit. They had a soup line, and once a day, these people would line up with their soup bowls to get that soup, which was probably the only meal they had during the day. And that's a picture you do not forget very easily.
Is that here in Creston?
It was in Oklahoma. That soup line was in Oklahoma City when I was with a friend at the St. Anthony Hospital there.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that on the whole, the people in this area fared pretty well during the Depression?
Well, of course, it was mostly a barter proposition. If a man would have maybe I remember one time that I was taking care of a lady, and so her husband paid me he butchered a big hog, and I took it and then passed it on to another family that did not have that chance, kept some for myself, but the people did not. They did not lose. We had the Dust Bowl, but it was such a much smaller instance than it was in the northwest part of the state. That people did not lose confidence, but what they would again, the conditions would get better. Farmers as a whole, if you do not have that optimism, you do not stay on a farm, because if it's not storm or weather or something, there's something else, or bugs or something else. But we did not lose that confidence that we would make a comeback. And while a few times it had been the dust would come in, it would come in rolling in. You'd see it just like a big storm cloud. And the only way that you could get out would be with a damp cloth over your face. But like I say, those times were not too many in this area, not like they were farther to the northwest.
About how long after Depression times and so on did Crescent begin to be the oil center that it is now?
Well, in fact, it was before that, really, that I'd have to give you. I'm sorry, I cannot give you the exact time. I could have to go to my...
Just estimated.
Because the first oil discovered in Logan County was on the farm I grew up on.
Really?
But then, of course, it was. There's never been a very big field there. Then it was in the later years that the main field south of Crescent was where the large wells were. But that was, that of course, there was various places. The oil was working, and some of the people would take their teams and go and work in the oil field. Of course, practically all the work was done with the getting ready for the wells, and all was done with horses and slips and things that time. It wasn't in fact, my son first went to work in the oil fields when they were using he went to work for a neighbor that had a good many teams.
I believe there were new sands that were discovered about a few years ago.
Yeah.
Is it a shallower well that they're working now, or was it deeper?
No, the wells now are where they're going back reworking oil fields. They're going into deeper sands. It was as it is today. The earlier fields, while not shallow as the fields were in the Osage country, yet they were shallow compared to the wells of today.
Do you recall when approximately was the well drilled that was on your farm?
It was in the 20s, but like I say, I have a picture, but I didn't think about, and after the fire, my pictures have been so messed up that I didn't think to look about the picture. I have a picture of that, but it was in the 20s, I'm pretty sure.
Could you describe how they drilled the well then?
Well, of course, like I say, the first work was done, digging the pit, as they called it, everything, was with a team, like down in the Oklahoma field, down Seminole field. They was with 4 horses, not 2, but these around here were not such hard. And they were drilled with, pits were dug with a team, and they call a slip. And then the machinery would be moved in. Lots of the machinery was moved in also by horses or mules. And of course they get stuck in the mud. There were no good roads of that day. And this wooden derrick was put up. As I say, would be wouldn't get very far in today's drilling. But the wells were not shallow as it was in the Blackwell, in the Ponca field, but yet it was shallow by the side of our wells today. And they would generally complete the well with this wooden derrick. Then in later years, then they would have one type of engine that would until they set the pipe until they felt like they were about to strike the oil, and then they would move that off and put in a heavier engine and equipment. And a lot of the old derricks would be moved as soon as the well was completed and put on what they called a pump. Then this derrick was knocked down and assembled and moved to another location.
Did they find oil on your farm?
Yeah, they found. Of course, it was never a large producing. Yes, it was, and it's still it's being worked to some extent, but not much.
Shall we get to her trips now?
Yes, we might. I think.
I think it would be good for you to tell us something about this interesting trip that you have the pictures of here.
Oh, the Delta Queen? Well, of course, that has been, I have, perhaps I'd better say first that I have traveled a good many thousand miles from the East Coast to the West Coast and back and forth by bus. I'm very strong in believing leave the driving to us, like the Greyhound says. And I have enjoyed, because I did not, when I travel, I do not travel at night. I get off and get a hotel room and then continue my trip the next day, but no matter whether I'm going east or west. But this present trip that you're speaking about, I just recently returned the last of February, I beg your pardon, was that trip down the Delta Queen, on the Delta Queen down the Mississippi, something I had always wanted from the first time I read Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. In fact, it was rather amusing on the boat those days. Why, some of the people had never even heard of, and I said, why, I hunted up my back issues, back books, and read Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer all over again after I'd signed up for it. But we went by chartered bus to Little Rock, Arkansas, and boarded the Delta Queen there, and then on a Monday evening, and both on that night and day travel, they tied up that first evening on account of the high water at Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and then we went down the boarded, entered the Mississippi at 3:30 that afternoon. Then the rest of that day, all day on Tuesday, we were traveled by day. But the water was higher than it'd been on it twice before. The boat was going at 16, where it's supposed to go 10. But it was interesting to be on that old Delta Queen that had first was traveling from Sacramento up the river there in California and came down around the Panama Canal, was restored to work on the Mississippi. And one thing is the carpeting and all had been kept as near the original as possible, and they took 2 men all of one day each week to even keep the brass polished on that. Every possible thing was a solid brass, and they put in one day. And then, of course, the entertainment, the food was wonderful. The entertainment was all dated back from the gay 90s on past, which, of course, as it happened, was just as happened to be my alley. Having lived through those times myself, the drummer of the boat, he and his wife had been in show business since after World War I, and he was just 1 month older than I am, so we had quite an enjoyable time together. And then we docked at New Orleans, where I had friends waiting, and we toured. We stayed at the very lovely Royal Orleans out in the French Quarter. I'd only been in New Orleans twice before in a short time. I'd planned to stay longer, but I had to, by being chartered bus, I had to come back, leave Saturday morning. But I visited with friends through the old French Quarter that day, and drove out to some friends out at a little suburb where he's now a minister at the church there, and then boarded the chartered bus on Saturday morning and came back up through Shreveport and over into Arkansas. And we stayed all night at Texarkana and into Oklahoma City that Sunday evening. About 200 on the boat, and it was, like I say, it was very enjoyable.
Well, this has certainly been an interesting interview, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
We appreciate so much you giving us the time, Ms. Rigdon,
Well, I appreciate your taking the time.
telling us all of these things that will be, well, they'll just be so interesting to people. Say, well, they are now, but you say 10 or 15 years from now, and we're going to really be looking for things like this in our historical research.
Yeah, because I have to say that I am now the oldest living person in this town, and of course I only came in '91. We buried the lady that her father had made around. We buried her. She was in her 90s about a month ago. And there's a lot of this. I have been, you speaking about taping, I have several times been thinking I would tape the difference in the lighting. It's all the changes of the lighting that has been done through the years, and the kitchen utensils and things that are used today, and the kitchen utensils and things that were used as I was growing up. But I've always seemed like too busy to take the time.
Well, we hope you do that, on both subjects. We have a most interesting tape from a lady in Norman on hats through the years, and hers begins back about 1904 or 5, and comes up to now. And it's all the different hats that were worn at the different occasions of her life. Yeah. And it made a most interesting tape and story as well. Well, we surely wish you the very best of health, and we want to keep in touch with you.
Well, I appreciate it very much.
Well, let us hear from you, and I'm leaving my card here, and let us hear from you because we want to keep up with you.
Okay.
And as you do new things and press on to new interests, we want to find out about it.
That's right. And we want to wish you many, many more active years.
Right. Well, I hope I can have that because I appreciate the